least the host that you got. And today I have a very special guest, Devon Brown. We met back at Michigan. And by the way, at the time of recording this episode, U of M is just coming off of a huge win at the game, the only game that matters, by the way, just yesterday. Man, how you feeling about that? Were you watching the game?
I actually did not watch the game. I know,
Really?
don't sue me. But
Really?
yeah, no, I heard it was absolutely insane, and I'm very pumped that we won.
Man, it was phenomenal. We were at 6th and Peabody at Nashville, and it's this kind of like sports bar type of thing, indoor, outdoor, giant screens everywhere, and that's like their niche, right? Is they just broadcast all the big games, and it was cool because Nashville was like a neutral site. So you had the Michigan folks sitting on one side, the OSU folks sitting on the other side. But it was a fun one. Yesterday was a crazy one actually because Alabama and Auburn, the Iron Bowl, ended in a ridiculous 4th and a mile and a half long conversion. OSU and Michigan ended with an interception. Washington almost got knocked off by Washington State, saved by their kicker. Yeah, it was just a crazy day. But anyway, we're not here to talk about football. I'm getting distracted. You
sure?
were yeah, honestly. So you were not too far from the football team. You did cheer at Michigan, so you were on the field for quite a few of those games. Tell me a little bit about how you got started with cheer. You know, did you choose it? Did it choose you? Like, how did that kind of evolution come about where you found yourself on the Michigan cheer team?
Yeah, so funny story. I was always kind of like a backyard tumbler. So when I was really, really little, I did gymnastics, and then we didn't really have the money to continue with that. So in middle school, I taught myself how to do a backflip. And from there, I loved the sport, just didn't really have access to it financially. Then I was in high school, I did pole vaulting, and I was on the track team and played soccer. And when I was in college, I just started to really miss sports. Like my freshman year there, I tried everything that wasn't sports because I wasn't a D1 athlete on that level for soccer or track. And my friend said, "Hey, you should try out for the cheer team." And I was like, "Absolutely not. That sounds horrible. I would never." And so I tried everything there was to try. Sophomore year rolls around. I'm really, really missing athletics. So I was like, you know what? Fine, I'll give it a shot. So I try out. I end up falling in love with it. And I've been there ever since.
That's awesome. What do you think the resistance came from? Why didn't you want to do it?
Well, there's definitely a stigma against cheerleading, right? Like it's not seen as something that a straight man does all the time. So I mean, just saying
only some of the times, not all the time, but only sometimes.
Right. So there's a bit of a stigma against being a male cheerleader, right? It's not considered a sport by a lot of people, even though it's becoming Olympic soon, which is pretty cool. And plus you don't really know going into it what competitive cheerleading is, which is completely different from sideline cheer. Sideline cheer is fun in its own ways, right? You get to go travel, you get to be at the games, you get to be on the field. But competitive cheer is what I fell in love with.
Yeah. And just briefly for the audience who might not be familiar, what's the difference between the two?
Yeah. So sideline, like I said, you're down on the field. You get to cheer for the games. You do pyramids and things like that, just in between plays. But for competitive cheer, you got like a 2.5 minute routine that you perform. There's certain criteria that you have to hit. Your coach will put together a routine that hits those requirements, and then your job is to just do it the way that you're supposed to. It's basically a coordinated gymnastics routine where you throw each other around and you do flips all at the same time in different ways.
Yeah. It was always fun for me to be able to watch competitive cheer because I always saw the resemblance to gymnastics. It's gymnastics plus stunting kind of combined into one, which is really, really cool. So talk to me about the stigma thing for a minute. And this is totally left from where I was, planning on going with this. But since you brought it up, I think that's a really interesting question, because I've kind of faced the exact same thing with men's gymnastics. Obviously, it's not a very popular sport, and there's kind of a stigma around it, and people have certain assumptions that they make when they see a grown man in a leotard, which, hey, fair enough. But man, like, how did you, because now you strike me as the type of person who, and forgive me if I'm wrong, or correct me if I'm wrong, I should say, you strike me as the type of person who I don't really care what other people think. I'm going to do me and be very confident in that. Is that an accurate assumption? like of today's Devon, or not really? It is.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's pretty accurate.
So did you
There's
have that back then? Like when you started cheering, or no? Like did you
yes
have
and
to
no.
second guess it?
That's a really interesting question because when I was growing up, like for the majority of my life, I didn't really live for me. And we could
Hmm.
that's a whole other podcast, but
Wow.
um, but yeah, like I spent a lot of my life growing up being a people pleaser, only doing what other people would have expected of me.
Hmm.
Um, and as I got older, yeah, I've started to sort of shake that off because I
Yeah.
understand that that's not a productive way to think or live. And it did not make me a happy person.
So was that people pleaser habit correlated with maybe some hesitation going into cheer based on fear of other people's opinions?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Where did the people pleasing thing come from? Since you're going to open the can of worms, I mean, I gotta dive
Man,
in.
yeah, this people pleasing thing. Where did it come from? I feel like I that's just kind of how I grew up. Like nobody, I never felt pressured by my family to be a certain way, other than like everyone kind of has their expectations of this is just kind of how
Mm,
that person is. I don't know. I think that I wanted to be liked by everybody. And to do
mm.
that, you have to change who you are to an, you know what? Well, to an extent, you have to.
Well, I
Do
think
you know what
that's
I'm
what
trying
we
to
think
say?
we have to do, right? Like, I
Right. That's
think
what
that
you think
we,
you have to do as a kid.
yeah, like in reality, the people that most people are genuinely like attracted to and like tend to be the people who are authentically them and they stand out and they're unique and they
That's
stand on who they
exactly.
are, right? Um, and again, that's how I see you as now. Give me a little bit about like what was the bridge between growing up with a little bit of that people pleaser mentality. How did you recognize that it wasn't serving you, and then what did you do to change it?
Yeah. Something that I've learned over time is that pain and bad negative emotions
Hmm.
are indicators that you need to change something.
Hmm.
Um, you need some sort of pain. Otherwise, I mean, otherwise you're going to continue living the same way. So
Yeah.
I experienced a lot of pain, and that is what led me to change. Right. At first I had no idea what it was. I didn't even know that I was so deep in living for everyone else that I didn't even know I was
Hmm.
doing it. It felt like me at that point. Um,
Hmm.
but somewhere along the way in college, I started to realize that I was different than the person that I was living as, and then yeah, from there
Wow.
that pain enabled me to move through it.
Yeah. So, and I'm a big proponent of that, by the way. It's funny, we didn't talk about this at all. This is completely cold, unscripted, but I'm a huge proponent of that idea that a lot of people are trying to find a quick fix to alleviate their pain instead of listening to their pain. They want to get rid of it when
Absolutely.
in reality, like that is a biologically, psychologically hardwired mechanism to indicate to you that you are not being or living up to all that you possibly could be. Like something's wrong and could be improved here. It's like, hey, if you touch the hot stove, your brain says this is not a good condition for me to survive in. Likewise, psychologically, you might be touching a hot stove right now in the form of people pleasing or destructive behavior or whatever it is. And that's your brain telling you, hey, like that cognitive dissonance, that feeling of pain that you feel is your body telling you, hey, this is not an environment that's conducive to your success or survival. So what were some of the symptoms? You mentioned feeling like the person that you really were was not who you were showing up as. What were some of the symptoms? Because I believe a lot of people will identify with symptoms before they understand what the cause is. They'll be like, man, I feel super anxious all the time. I don't know why. It's like, yeah, you might not know why yet, but if you can at least recognize the symptoms and then correlate that with, oh, maybe it's because I'm living for other people more than myself or whatever the root cause may be, then it can start that process of figuring out what the root is and fixing it. So what were you experiencing in that time of your life where you felt like you were being inauthentic and living for others?
Yeah, I experienced a lot of anxiety, um, like constantly wondering what should I be saying, what should I be doing,
Mm.
Because when you're living as an authentic person, you don't have to think about what you should be doing. You just do because that's what
Mm.
because, you know what I mean?
Mm.
So lots and lots of anxiety over, oh, I'm with this person. Like, what should I be saying right now? I mean, there, to an extent, even if you are being authentic, right? We have wide ranges of who we are as people.
Mm.
And so it is important to, even if you are being authentic, to lean into different pieces of your authenticity
Sure.
when you're around. Right? Like it shouldn't feel inauthentic. This is like way down the line for people that like are still living as someone else. This is way down the line because then you have to learn to be authentic. And then you're like, wait a minute, it's not inauthentic to lean into certain parts of my personality more
Yeah,
at
yeah.
certain
As long as that's it's an actual part of you and not something that you're making up to appease somebody else, right?
Right, right, exactly. So that's like that's 202, not 101.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so lots of anxiety. Just kind of like a brain fog of no mental clarity whatsoever. Everything felt
Mm.
I don't know, forced. I guess.
Yeah.
Got to
Yeah.
think of there's plenty of things. Let's come back to this one because I'll be able
I
to
mean,
give you a
even
more.
with that though, that's interesting because something that I find with a lot of people is, especially in our age group, right? That kind of early 20s, late 20s, early 30s, a lot of people say that they're struggling to find clarity. That's something that I've noticed, especially in today's
Yeah,
world, because I think that the options have opened up for people in a way that they've never been open before with social media. Just entrepreneurially, there's ways to make a living and live your life and develop a lifestyle that wasn't necessarily available 40 years ago. The whole digital nomad thing wasn't really around 40, 50 years ago, whereas now it's a real option. And with the advent of social media, you can see what everybody else is doing. So you might be perfectly content doing, I don't know, you're a car mechanic and you're like, hey, I'm totally content doing this. And then you see somebody on social media who is airplane mechanic. And you're like, oh, maybe I should switch into airplanes. And then you see somebody else who works on boats. And you're like, oh, maybe I should go to boats. It's like, you know, you start getting this overwhelm of the sea of options, and I think that didn't really used to exist. And so what I'm hearing a little bit from you is, hey, maybe that lack of clarity isn't that you need to find your purpose, find your calling. Maybe you just got to figure out who you even are. Like you're trying to do level 7 of finding what you were put here to do. You don't even know who you are yet, so how could you possibly know how to use who you are? Does that make
right.
sense?
Oh, 100%. The very first thing, um, I've sort of come up with a mental curriculum that I teach my athletes. We're not into all that yet, but um, the very first thing that we do is ask the question, "Who are you?" And then, of course, there's a
Mm,
bunch of questions that branch off out of that. But how are you supposed to come up with goals and belief systems and values if you don't even know, like at your core, who you are as a
mm,
person? And that's a big question to ask, like middle schoolers and high schoolers, which
yeah.
is primarily who I work with. But like, it's an important question to get them thinking about at that age, at the very least.
Yeah, and it sounds like that was a question that you had to ask yourself in college at that time. So
Yes.
let me ask you, what were some of the things that you did back then to answer that question? And what are some ways that you would encourage people now? I know you work with a lot of young athletes, like you said, middle school, high school, mostly cheerleaders. What did you do back then to figure out who you were? And how do you help people now figure out who they are?
Yeah. So back then, oh man, it was a process. This took like years of figuring out myself how to
Mm,
figure out who I was as a person because I didn't have much of a guide on how to do that. I sort of slogged through it myself. And then most of my friends, they were just either living authentically or they hadn't even like figured out that they're not living authentically yet.
yeah. Yeah.
It's like in the matrix, I guess. Um, but yeah, so some things that I did is just be really introspective for one. Like
Mm,
you have to ask yourself why, not just like, oh, I'm not just figuring out like I'm feeling this way, but why am I feeling this way? And then continue down that rabbit hole until you find the root cause, right? Because it could be
yeah.
I feel sick because I went out last night. Well, why did I go out last night? Well, why did I feel like I had to do that? Or is it because I'm looking for
Mm,
um, companionship with friends? Do I actually enjoy the act of going out? why did I drink? Do I even like drinking? Like, you have to really get down to the
Mhm.
root cause. And this is how I coach as well. Even the athletic portions of things. If you're not figuring out what the root cause is, you're just treating a symptom, which
Mm.
is what you said earlier.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I always think and just to clarify that point, it's easier to identify, it's easier to start the process by saying, okay, what are my symptoms? But like you said, if you don't get to the root cause, then nothing changes. You can
Right.
treat a symptom all day long, but if the root cause is still there, you're really just masking something. You're not solving a problem. One thing that you mentioned that I think is so important for people to understand is that you just said it takes years. This is not something where you go read one self-help book on a weekend and you know who you are and why you're here. It's like, that's not how it works. It's a process of discovery, and it takes intentional effort. You can't put in, it's like the gym, right? With you getting really good at tumbling, you can't practice for one day and expect to, be a champion. You have to practice over and over and over and over again. And,
Exactly.
one of my buddies says this thing where he says, self-awareness expires pretty quickly. Like, self-awareness has a
Mm.
very short shelf life, because as you grow and as you change, you have to continue discovering. You have to continue working on you. You have to continue that introspective process, because new habits and new things will pop up that maybe weren't an issue in the past, right? Like, you're going to have new patterns of
100%.
behavior when you're 40 and have kids compared to when you're 20 and in college, but they might still be coming from the same place. But again, I don't want to get too deep into that, but just that continual process of self-awareness, I think, is super, super important. So what are some of those questions that you ask? Like you just keep asking until you get to something solid. So what do you do once you get to something solid? Like, what do you do with that?
So that's a good question. When you get to the root, you can ask yourself, what are some productive ways that I can meet that need that I've found in myself? Right? Because one of
Mm,
my needs, as I got into a little bit, is this companionship portion. All humans need companionship, but I found that
yeah.
that was a need that I felt that I was lacking. And if you feel
Mm,
that you are lacking something, you are going to come from a place of lack as you search for
yeah.
it, come unless you recognize it and then can intentionally come from a place of abundance. You say, actually, you know what, here's where I can find some of that thing that I felt that I'm lacking. Here's where I
Mm.
have it, and here's where I can get more of that. Once you start to meet those needs, then you're able to heal that wound a little bit, I think.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I'm big on is produce, don't consume. I think that a lot of people find ways to consume the things that they need, or the feelings that they want. So, for example,
Yep.
if you have a craving for the feeling of peace, right, of low anxiety, it's easier to consume that at the bottom of a bottle than it is to produce that by setting up a lifestyle filled with positive habits of, meditation, of staying present, of mindfulness, et cetera, et cetera. And so people, because it's simply easier, they consume what they want out of life instead of producing what they want out of life. The problem with that is, anytime that you consume something, it comes at a price, right? Whereas when you produce it, because you are in many ways an infinitely creative being, um, you have the ability to produce those feelings without paying a cost, right?
Right.
Um, Myron Golden has this thing. He's a big entrepreneur, and he says that the biggest thing that he's discovered about money and finance is that everything costs the same. It just costs his creativity,
Hmm.
right? Like, it costs him the same amount of creativity to create this product versus this business versus that business. It only costs creativity. But the thing is, it doesn't deplete from his creativity when he uses his creativity. He has just as much as when he started. And so that's an idea of, again, producing so that there is no cost associated with it. It's just coming from, like you said, that place of abundance, rather than trying to consume it and then having to pay for it either in a hangover or in dollars or in missed opportunities or in time or anything else. Okay, so anyway, you go through this whole journey, right? You become a little bit more self-aware. I think there's a gap for people between gaining the self-awareness and then acting on it. And I was that person, right? I knew that I was going to be a better coach than an athlete, but I felt like there was a stigma of, well, you're supposed to be the athlete, because, like, you got to be MJ. You can't be, what's his name? Phil Jackson, right? that's more attractive to people. Um,
100%.
and I let that affect my decisions. And I probably would have been years ahead if I had started coaching earlier, right? Because I knew that I would be more successful at it. So where do you get the confidence to, once you identify, oh, here's the need that I need to figure out how to produce in my own life? How do you get the confidence to break away from the crowd and say, you know what? I don't want to follow the crowd. I don't want to take the path more traveled on. I'm going to do something a little bit weird, out of the ordinary, and figure out how to produce this on my own. And it's going to make me stand out. That's going to put a target on my back. Where's that confidence come from?
Man, that's a fantastic question, because that one thing took me that's probably the longest journey for me, was getting that
Really?
self-confidence to just do it. I knew for years before I decided to do my own thing that I wanted to do my own thing, and I just couldn't get, it felt like I couldn't get myself to do it. Right? All I
Yeah.
had to do was take action, but taking that action is the hardest thing that you can do. So as far as your question, where did I get that confidence?
Well,
Personally,
and let me ask you this:
yeah.
why? Let's kind of take it step by step.
Hmm.
Why is it such a hard thing to do? What are the roadblocks in the way? And then we'll get to how to overcome those roadblocks afterwards.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just biologically, we're wired against change. So
Mm.
if something is working for you, as in it is you allowing you to survive, even if it's not optimal, you will continue to do that thing, unless you actively change it. And it's really hard to actively change it when you're wired against doing that, because you know that what you're doing is you are surviving doing that, even if it's worse than the other option. So
Yeah.
there's that. There's a pressure, even if it's not intentional, there's a pressure from the people around you to continue to be the same person that you are. Like, oh yeah,
Mm.
that's Devon. Like he's that's who he is, right? Like it's weird. Even if you could be someone so much more, um, there's a pressure to stay the same from everyone. It's
Yeah.
really odd. Um, what else? There's I would say that those are some of the main forces in my life that kept me
Mm.
the same. And then there's this internal belief that you, at least for me, there's a big voice in my head saying, nope, this is where you should be. Like, even though you know that this is not where you should be, like, this is where you
Mm.
deserve to be, almost. Um, yeah. So there's like I feel like it's really easy when you're living inauthentically to develop some sort of, I don't want to say self-loathing, but kind of
Mm.
self-loathing, right? Like I hated that I wasn't being the person that I knew that I could be. And because of that, my brain was like, you deserve to stay the same.
Wow. One thing that I often tell people is that that voice is probably right. It shocks people when I tell them that. That voice in your head that keeps telling you you're not good enough, that voice in your head that keeps saying you can't do it, that voice in your head that keeps saying, you're not enough. It's probably right. But the reason that it's right is because you're not really being you. The
Right.
reason that it's right is because the Walmart brand copy of whoever
Is
you're
winning.
trying to right, like whoever you're trying to emulate, you being a third or fourth or fifth rate version of somebody else, of course you're not capable of living up to your potential. Of course you're not capable. Of course you're not enough in terms of being able to do everything that you're put here to do. But the real you is, so you don't have to be anything or anybody different. You just have to be all of who you actually are. So okay, so we got some of those forces. We got the limiting beliefs about ourselves. We feeling like we deserve less than what we really should.
Right.
We've got the opinions of others. We've got the box that people put us in. How people remember us from our past, and what people expect of us. What's the rocket fuel to break us through the barrier here?
For me, it was I had no other option. Right.
Mm.
I was nearing the end of the road of like, if this is how life is going to be, I don't want it.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be different for everybody, and I hope that it doesn't get to that point. But it brings me back to my point of, I needed to feel enough pain before I was able to
Mm.
make that change. I think that there's a positive way where you can surround yourself with people that want similar things from life, and that's going to be a much more productive way to do it. But I didn't feel like I had those people in my life at the time, and so for me, it was, I needed enough pain. I need to feel the pressure of that before I was able to do it myself.
Yeah, yeah. Was there a particular breaking point where it was like on one day you just woke up? Because and I would love to hear your thoughts about this, but for me, people say that you don't change overnight. I've only ever seen people change overnight. Now, the results of that change might take years to show up externally, but usually I find that it's a split second decision where somebody says, you know what, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. I'm not going back. This is not the real me. I'm not dealing with this. It's over. And they become a new version of themselves right then and there because their standard internally shifted, right?
Sure, sure.
And that's one decision, and then you just have to act like you mean it for the next however many years until you see the external results. So was there a moment like that for you, or was it really just like a slow exposure type of thing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I would say for me, it was kind of, it's tough because I ultimately made the decision I want to coach. That was the decision that I made. As for making that my life, and I like to say having the audacity
Yeah.
to do that and to make that my career, I do think it was a little bit of a slow burner for me. Like I had spent so many years living unconfidently, not as myself, that and I had tried before to make that decision and
Mm.
make the internal shift instantaneous, and it just hadn't worked for me. And then I would get
Mm.
disillusioned because I was like, oh, I tried to make this huge decision and I failed, and
Yeah.
now I'm gonna just go back to even worse than I was before because I just feel so bad about myself. So
Yeah.
it's very interesting that you say that. I think that it does work for people to do it the way that you were saying. But I also want to make it clear to a lot of other people that might be listening, like there will be a lot of you out there that like try to make that big leap and then you fail, or it feels like you failed, and then your instinct is going to be even worse than before, and that's going to happen like
Yeah.
a bunch of times before you actually succeed. So just, yeah, that's for those
Yeah,
people out
yeah.
there.
You get into that cycle, right? And I think what it is people try to make that one decision in a moment and they're not really ready for it.
That's true.
Like they don't really have internally what it takes to back up that decision yet. I think that a lot of times what happens to people is there's this slow buildup and the slow exposure to the right traits, qualities, mentalities that is actually going to get them over that threshold. So it's like it might take you 10 years to get ready to make that decision. And then you finally, like, something happens where you get pushed over the edge of that threshold between 1 and 0, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, now I've really got what it takes to make the decision and back it up over time and not go back. What were some of the things that you did on that kind of slow, like as you approached that point of no return for the better, right? What were some of those things that you did to help build you up internally to where, like, because presumably you went up and then back down and then up and then back down and then
Yes.
up, but at one point you just went up and you stayed up. What
Yeah.
was the difference between the up
Well,
and down timeline and the up and stay up timeline?
I want to emphasize that it's still an up and down. It's just instead of up and down here, it's up and down here, right?
A
So
higher level, a
we are
higher level.
staying
Right,
up.
right.
It's just, we're oscillating at a different level than we were before.
The floor
um,
has increased.
yes, yes, exactly. So yeah, what are some things that I did? So it's funny you say produce, not consume. I agree, but there is something to be said for consumption. Make sure that the content that you do consume is filling you up
Mm,
and not
yeah.
either. There's plenty of content that I enjoy that is completely like useless to me as far as self improvement goes. And you don't have to listen to not everything you listen to has to be for self improvement. However, one thing that helped me a ton and that opened my eyes a lot was listening to people. Like, if you're listening to this podcast right now, this is a really good place to be because you're around like-minded people. Even if you're not around us
Mm,
physically, you're hearing us. And every time that you hear someone saying something that's in alignment with who you are, truly deeply inside of you, then that is how you're going to start to make that shift. Or that's how I
mm.
made a lot of my shifts. That's like
Yeah,
the biggest
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, I think it's that exposure, and I think that's a great point you made about, consuming the content as well, because a lot of people will say, well, I can't change my physical environment. I can't move somewhere else. I can't get around new friends. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe, maybe not, but you can change your digital environment. You can change the
Easily.
voices that you're listening to, your influences, right? Tony
Right.
Robbins has that quote where he says, weeds grow automatically, flowers take effort. I think your mind is the same way, you've got to intentionally water the garden of your mind with good influences.
Yes.
Um, that's such a good point. Okay, so let's fast forward just a little bit here. So you get through sort of that inauthentic phase. You're on the team at Michigan, right? D1 athlete. You're not going to say it, so I will. You were probably the best on the team, if not the best, then absolutely one of. At least from a tumbling perspective, like you were at another level than almost everybody else around you. What was the difference between you and some of your teammates? Not throwing them under the bus, but I'm just
Sure.
saying, like, not everybody who goes into an environment like that is able to do, some of the skills that you were able to do up to the level and the standard of perfection that you were able to do them at. So, what was different between you and everybody else who was in the similar environment?
Yeah. So, couple things on that. The first thing is, like I said, I was a backyard tumbler coming into this. So my first year on the team, I spent a lot of time just working on the fundamentals, which I had no clue about going into that. Right? Like I said, oh, if I get over my head and I land on my feet, that's a backflip. Like that's
That's
great.
a success.
I did a good job.
Success.
So, but analyzing everything on a very deep level, more than just if I throw my head over my feet or my feet over my head and I land on my feet, that's great. That wasn't enough for me. So that was the first thing, as being deeply analytical about it. Another thing is I just worked so hard. Like
Mm-hmm.
after after every practice, if I could stay longer, I would. I would get my friends to do the same. Like I remember vividly a couple of practices where we would finish up the main practice for nationals and then we would go out on the track on the way home and we would just run sprints. Why? I don't know. We wanted to work hard. We enjoyed the feeling of bettering ourselves. So that is one of the things that allowed me to grow in skill the way that I did, because not a lot of people can say that they went from hardly having a backflip to working on standing fulls and running doubles in two years basically.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's crazy fast. That's crazy fast. Was there an intrinsic desire to work hard? Like, was it a competitive thing? Like, you want to work harder than other people? Was it an intrinsic thing? I just want to be the best that I can be. Where did that come from?
For me, it was intrinsic.
Okay.
I do most of my life. I did just want to be better than other people.
Mm,
So the comparison thing, I did leave that behind in my college days. Um, it is just a race against myself at this point, and I really enjoy the feeling of closing that gap between my potential and where I'm at.
yeah. How do you get people to, I guess, appreciate what that feels like? I've met a lot of people
Mm.
who hyper competitive and it works for them, but at some point, as soon as the carrot stops getting dangled in front of their face, they kind of lose that edge because there's nothing intrinsic that, and I think that even when it comes to overcoming obstacles and adversity, at a certain point, like how big is the carrot? If the
Right.
carrot isn't big enough, and your motivation isn't intrinsic, at some point you're going to run into something that's going to stop you. So, how do you make that shift? Was that part of becoming authentic? Was that part of stopping to be a people pleaser and comparing yourself to others? How do you make the shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation?
That's a really interesting one, because as a coach, I do my best to help people along that path. But as a person, this is one of the few things that I did not have to do on my own. I was,
Mm,
for whatever reason, born with an intrinsic motivation to just be the best that I can be at everything that I do. Um,
mm,
so yeah, I can't answer that one from experience. So, but what I can do is say that while I'm working with my athletes, I try to celebrate their work and their effort, and make that the main point. Because if I can
mm,
teach them to be good people and hardworking people, and I reward that rather than the result, it becomes a lot better, right? Because the result is kind of the carrot dangling in
Yeah.
front of them. Um, Whereas if you make the effort and the camaraderie and all of these things, like the athlete is bound to become good if you, or great even if you work on those things specifically.
Yeah. Yeah. I think from a leadership perspective, that's a phenomenal point. Whether you're coaching, whether you're managing, but any sort of leadership, even self leadership for that matter, this is a practice that you can start to use with yourself. I mean, you don't have to have a coach there to congratulate you. Like sometimes you got to give yourself your own flowers. You got to pat your own self
Yeah,
on the back. But rewarding the behavior, the character traits, the qualities, rewarding you as opposed to rewarding the result is so critical, because if you can instill the positive habits and patterns of behavior and create the right person, the results are only a matter of time. If you
exactly.
only focus on the results, you might, as one of my mentors, ET, would say, you might let your talent take you somewhere that your character can't keep you. If you only focus on the results and not on the actions and behaviors that produce those results. So I think that's a critical mindset shift for anybody. Something that came up for me though when you were speaking on the intrinsic motivation. And I think this is something that I see with myself. So I might just be projecting this onto you to see if I
Okay.
get anything back. I don't know. Um, I think I grew up somewhat similarly. I don't know the exact specifics of why you became that people pleasing person, but for me, growing up without my biological father in my life, I feel like there was a little bit of a intrinsic I'm not good enough feeling within me, and I was trying to cover that up, right? I was trying to find something to fill that hole that I felt. And for me, in some ways, I think that as I matured, that I'm not good enough turned into I'm going to see how good I can get. Very subtle
Yeah.
shift, but that people pleasing, trying to find something to fill that hole with ended up turning into this fire inside of me of bet. Let's see how far I can take this thing. Like, let's see how good I can get. And I think at first it was a very immature version of it, right? It was a let me see how good I can get so I can say, I told you so to everybody else, right?
Sure.
And now it's this more developed, more mature, almost spiritual concept where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, well, my real father, at least in my, eyes, my spiritual father would want me to be everything that he gave me the capacity or capability of being, right? I would want to live up to his expectations. I would want to extract every ounce of potential that I was blessed with. So now it's at that more developed point now, but I think that there's a strong correlation between that intrinsic motivation and that people pleasing, not good enough mentality of the inner 7-year-old child in me. Do you feel like, does that resonate with you at all, or am I like alone in that?
There have definitely been lots of times in my life where I've felt not good enough. I still struggle with that from time to time. Like I've gone home from coaching, and in fact, one of the things that makes me a good coach um, is this feeling that I get of I could be doing better right now, and
Mm,
it's a it's really really important for people like me to understand that we're going to feel that, but what we do with it is what is important about it. Does that make sense?
yeah.
So like I'm going to feel it. It's not that I feel not good enough. There are times where I allow that to happen, unfortunately, right? Like
Mm,
we're not perfect. I can try all I want to feel whole and good all the time, but it's important to be able to feel that emotion when it happens, all right, and
yeah.
just sit with it. Like, oh, you know what? Why am I not feeling good enough right now? What could I be doing better? Right? Again, it's just you listening
Questions.
to that feeling, and that's what makes me a good coach, right? I will always continue to improve and grow as a coach and as a person because I
Mm,
have that feeling of is what I'm doing what I could be doing right now.
mm,
Like, am I achieving all that I'm capable of? Am I pouring into these kids the way that I could be?
mm.
Um, and so yeah, it can be painful for me at times, but it's also like it helps me to be the best that I can be. And as long as I'm not getting lost in that, I think
Yeah.
that it can be a powerful tool.
And how do you strike that balance? How do you not get lost in that? Like, how do you detach that inner desire to continue to improve and see how good you can get without allowing it to affect your self-esteem. Because I think that's kind of the balance, right? Is like, I am enough as I am. I
Yep.
am a mate, like I'm worthy, all of these things as I currently am today, but I could still be better and it's still worth trying to get better. What's the balance there? How do you
I
not
think that
let
you
one affect
just
the
said
other?
it in words. You said, I am enough as I am, and I can get better. Reminding yourself that what you are doing is enough is important. Like you said, it's
Mm,
subtle difference,
yeah.
small thing. It's not really small. Like it's big. It's a lot. It feels small at first. It feels
Mhm.
stupid when you first start doing it, and then you realize that you have to you have to celebrate where you're at. And if you don't, you're going to struggle to like improve or even stay where you're at. You're going to be at the level that you feel that you deserve to be. Um, and so
Mm,
celebrate where you are at as you
yeah.
improve. That's a big thing,
That's a big principle right there. Celebrate where you are and how far you've come while still, working for
while
more.
still striving
Um,
for that improvement. Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. That's good. Okay, I'm gonna press you on this one more time though.
Yeah, please.
Is there a link between that intrinsic motivation and some of those maybe child, I don't want to use the word trauma, but growing up and feeling like, you've got to please other people. You've got to appease other people's opinions. Is there a link to that for you
I'd say
or not
there's
really?
there's absolutely a link. When I was really little, though, I don't remember feeling. I don't know. I had a very blessed childhood. Like
Mm,
I was a happy kid. Um, didn't really struggle too much mentally. It wasn't until around like middle to late high school where I started to really feel
okay.
a lot of the trauma, I guess, for
Yeah,
lack of a
yeah.
better word. Yeah, no, where I started to really feel like, oh, I just uncomfortable a lot of days when I woke up. And
Mm.
that is a result of a lifetime of people pleasing and all of that. Kind of all circles back.
You know what that makes me think of is if you grow up in a really good environment like that, then you're kind of told either directly or subconsciously that you are worthy, that you are enough, that you are worthy of love and acceptance and all these other things, by your parents, by your family, by your immediate surroundings. If that's a big if, you grow up in a great environment, then those things are almost there by default. And I think that around that age that you're talking about, you get into high school, certainly when you get into college, I think that can be a little bit of a shock to people to find out that that doesn't come like baked into the deal with other people. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like,
I
hopefully
do.
your mom and dad just love you because they're your parents and your family's the same way. But other people in the real world, they might not like you. And some people respond to that by saying, cool, I totally get it. This is who I am. Not going to change it for you. It is what it is. I already know that I'm enough. I already know that I'm good to go, right? Some people respond to that by saying, oh my God, this is the first time I've ever encountered this situation where people don't love me for like just intrinsically. I got to do something now. Like now it almost sets the precedent where in order to feel enough, in order to get love, respect, appreciation, acceptance, I have to do something, right? And for a lot of people, that sets up a pattern of people pleasing that they can never shake, right? So I think that's why what you're doing with young athletes is so cool because you get to them early and you can say, hey, here's the behaviors and the patterns and the characteristics of who you are that I want to instill. But by the way, like you're enough. Like these are going to be things that are going to help you. I'm going to reward the behavior, right? Not the result, like we already talked about. But by the way, you're enough as you are, and getting to them young like that, I think is so important. I don't know if I have a question in there, but does that does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. I that is one of the things that I think is so important about what I'm doing, because I did not have an exposure to the way that I think now until I was in college, which
Yeah.
is crazy to me. Um, Literally, I cannot think of a person in my life that thinks the way that I do. Um, until I started meeting people in college and seeking out this kind of person.
Mm.
Um, and I love I'm so grateful for all these people in my life. However, I needed to hear this as a kid. Um, I, I'm glad that my life went the way that it did, and I'm, like I said, super grateful. However, things could have been. Um, I could have saved myself a lot of pain if I had had that voice
Yeah.
as a kid. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And give them a little backstory. I know we're talking as if we know, because we do know what the backstory is. But after, graduating from the team at Michigan,
hmm
tell them a little bit about what you're doing now and what you went on to do after the team.
Yeah. So long story short, I wanted to stay involved with cheerleading. So went down to Texas, got a sales job at a big corporation. Um, Once again, just kind of doing what I was supposed to do.
Mm.
Um, got that big sales job, hated it. But I went to a couple of local gyms and I was like, hey, do you guys have open gyms that I could come to and I could just tumble? And they were like, yes, and would you like a job? I was like, sure. Yeah, I'm looking for a job. Why not? So I started coaching with them at a couple of all-star gyms, one gymnastics gym, one all-star gym down in
Mm.
Texas. And that was my first exposure to formal coaching. And I say formal coaching because I was always a coach to my peers.
Yep.
It was something that just came so naturally to me. I love helping other people bring out the best in themselves. I like it more than bringing out the best in myself, and I really like doing that. So,
Yeah.
but anyway, so that was the start of my formalized coaching, and from there, long story short, moved back because COVID happened, and that was a whole ordeal. Started working with a tumbling coach in Michigan. He ended up moving away, and then I started a company very similar to the structure of his, with an emphasis on the mental side of the sport. So, like I said, we have like a mental curriculum that we try to bake in as well. Um, and then, yeah, the rest is history. Now I'm doing weekly tumbling classes at schools all over Michigan and helping kids out that way.
So cool. So cool. Talk to me a little bit about this mental curriculum. I've heard you mention it a couple of times. Don't give me away any trade secrets. Don't give away anything we got to pay for. But just surface level. What are some of the things that you try to walk these young athletes through?
Yeah. So, like I said, the first question we ask is, "Who are you?"
Mm.
And delving deep into what are your values, your beliefs, like what do you like, what do you want, what do you
Mhm.
believe, and really emphasizing the you, because when I was in high school, if someone asked me what I believe and what I thought, I would just write down whatever I thought that I was supposed to say. I'm dead serious. It's crazy, but that is who I was, and I
Yeah.
guarantee you that there's so many of my athletes that feel that way. So I try to make them feel as comfortable as possible being authentic, even though it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to be
Mm.
authentic. Um, that's a whole other thing we can get into. But so asking them who they are, what are the values and beliefs. Once they figured that out, who do they want to be? Is there a mismatch between those two people? Are you living as the person that you want to be? What are the traits and the beliefs and the habits that this person has?
Mm.
And then once we figured out who they are, who they want to be, what the gap is there, we try to figure out how to fill in that gap. Okay, so how can we start to become the person that we want to be? What are some limiting beliefs that you have that are holding you as the person that you are, that you can let go of to become the person that you want to be?
Yeah.
What are some habits that you can create in order to become that person? What are some ways that you can calm your brain down when you're in an intense situation, which you're going to run
Mm.
into in a competitive,
Yeah.
right? Like I had one shot to perform my nationals routine. Well, I guess two technically, but the 75% of our score was in one routine, right?
Mm.
And that you have to perform. There's a ton of pressure. So our athletes need to learn how to calm their brains down, ground themselves. So there's like a lot of things baked into it.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned that vulnerability. How do you balance or train an athlete to? And this is I'm using athletes as an example here because that's who you work with, but really this goes, I think, for all of us. How do you balance that vulnerability with the need for constructive criticism? Because especially as an athlete growing up, you're criticized every single day. all the time. And you kind of
Yeah,
have to
yeah,
learn to, I don't know if it's deal with it or productively do something with it, turn that criticism into something. That's a part of the job as an athlete is, hey, this needs to be better. This needs to be fixed. This needs to be improved. And, you mentioned vulnerability and the power of it. A lot of people under that level of scrutiny, they start to say, well, if I don't be so vulnerable, I won't be criticized so much. And I think for me, that happened almost. I'll tell you what happened for me. And maybe you can use me as a case study on how you would coach me, right?
perfect.
I was criticized so much in the gym, and to nobody's fault. That's not saying I had bad coaches or anything. It's just, like I said, it comes with the territory. That's what you sign up for. Is we are judged in the sport of gymnastics, cheerleading as well, based off of a standard of potential/perfection, right?
Right.
And how close you get to it is basically your score in layman's terms. So I get used to this criticism over and over and over and over again. And in the gym, I was cool with it because I understood that is what is the craziest thing. I understood in the gym that criticism is what was going to lead me to be the best that I could possibly be. And I was driven to be the best athlete that I could possibly be. But subconsciously, it took a toll on me. And so outside of the gym, I was the one dodging criticism left and right. I was the one that was being withdrawn, who was not being vulnerable with people emotionally in my communication. I was the one who was snapping back at people who said even the most minor criticism, right? Because I was overburdened with it on one end and I was running away from it in the other aspect of my life that wasn't in the gym. So, how would you train somebody to acknowledge the value of both the criticism as well as the vulnerability that's required to even accept and approach that criticism in all aspects of life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For that, in your case, I would ask what would you say that you put the emphasis on as far as your what did you value as an athlete the most? Why do you think that it was hard for you to? I mean, you said in the gym you could
Mm,
face the criticism, but it took a toll on you. So
yep.
clearly, it wasn't as clean of a cut as you may have thought at the time. So why do
Yeah.
you think it took that toll on you? Where do you think you placed your values?
Well, I think so. So I think it placed, or it took a toll on me because I still wasn't fully healed from that I'm not good enough syndrome. And so that was
No.
chipping away at the ego. It was chipping away at the self value, self worth.
Yeah.
And then what was the value thing. For me, the value was success, tangible first place,
Okay.
making the team and winning a championship. Nothing mattered to the point where I didn't care how I felt. Like me as a human being took a back seat to getting a bottom line result, which was for me just winning.
Got it. Yeah.
Even though it
So
didn't happen, by the way, which I think made
I'm
it worse.
you answered the exact way that I think that most people would answer, and also the exact way that I was hoping you would answer because I have a really good answer for you. um, so yeah, if you put all of your eggs in the winning basket, um, that's not something that you can necessarily control, is it? But
Mm,
you can always control how much effort that you put in. And if
mm,
you are trying as hard as you can every single time, or in understanding that how hard you can try varies from day to day,
yeah.
if you are doing that, and that is where you place your value, you will continue to achieve at a very high level. Okay. You will take the pressure off of winning, which is going to allow you to think more clearly when you actually need to perform.
Mm,
There's so many benefits to like understanding where you are putting your values and understanding whether that's a healthy place to put them or not. And in my opinion, like I said, it goes back to rewarding the effort and saying I
mm,
am enough where I am and I can continue to be better. And I love the
right.
process of doing that. Helping to
Yeah.
fall in love with the
It's
process of improvement is is by far the best way to help them get over the vulnerability piece of it.
That's so good. That is so, so good. Yeah. And I love what you said too about how hard you can possibly try today is not necessarily how hard you can possibly try tomorrow.
You cannot, you will burn out if you think that you
Yeah.
can try as hard as you can every single day. You will. A 100% chance that you will burn out if you try. I've been there.
The
I
money
am the
back
biggest
guarantee.
criminal when it comes to that. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. How do you? I mean, what's that conversation look like? Whether you're speaking to an athlete, and by the way, for people who are listening to this who aren't a coach, who have never been an athlete, etc., this is the conversation that you need to have with yourself. Like the coaching conversation that Devon's having with me, that's the conversation that you need to have with yourself at a certain point in your life. So how does that conversation go? Like, how do you convince somebody who is just dead set on winning everything? How do you convince them that actually, it's you will have a higher likelihood of getting what you want, which is the result of winning, by being more vulnerable and by just putting the focus on the effort and not the result. Like you will actually get more. It's both and it's not either or. You can be
Right.
happy with yourself, not stressed out, and also be a savage and win. How do you
Yeah.
convince people of that?
I think that giving them multiple exposures to it, right? So it, in my experience, and I will say, like, I'm more than happy to admit, I'm still a fairly new coach. I think that I'm extremely good at what I do and I've learned very quickly, but I'm still pretty new to it. I can't tell you, oh, I've been working with these athletes for 20 years and I've mastered the way on how to do this. But what I can say is that being able to, having these kids exposed to the information is the first step, period. End of story. I can tell you that with certainty, because if you haven't had an exposure to most people, winning is always what's taught. You do what
Yeah.
it takes to win, right? Okay, great. So you're putting my values in something that I can't control. That's wonderful. But that's what everyone's taught, and that's what's been passed down from generation to generation,
Yeah.
right? I think that this generation specifically is learning and opening their eyes to the fact that, oh, things are just objectively better when I put my value in something that I can control. So yeah, being that first exposure, showing them examples of athletes that that have done that for themselves, right? Those are the best ways to begin the process. And it is a process, right? Especially middle high school age kids. And I would have been the exact same way. They kind of roll their eyes. They're like, what is this? Like hooky stuff.
Yeah.
But once again, I pride myself in being that first exposure, because it's hard being the first exposure and getting your people, like everyone's rolling their eyes at you. I could do this with college level athletes and they'll nod their heads and be like, yeah, I get that. That actually makes a lot of sense. But working with middle and high schoolers, it's a first exposure. And then hopefully as they go down the line, they'll continue they'll be like, wait, Coach Devon was right. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Let me ask you this. Is there anything that you feel like is just jumping out at you that we need to talk about that we haven't based on the flow of the conversation yet? Like, are we missing anything to kind of complete this?
Off the top of my head, no. I'm feeling pretty satisfied. I think we got a lot of the information in there.
I love it. I love it. Well, tell them where people can find you, how they can sign up for the clinics, how they can put their kids, if they, they're past that age now, but they got kids, they want to put them in the clinic. Where do they go? How do they find you?
Yeah, so our website is nextgenathletics.net, or you can find us on Instagram at NEXXT Gen Athletics. I messaged Next Gen Athletics on Instagram. No word. They wouldn't give me the handle. They follow TRX or something. So reach out to TRX, help us out. We want that handle, but it's Next Gen Athletics with 2 X's on Instagram. Or you can find us on Facebook. I never post on Facebook, so you can ignore that. Just find us on Instagram or our website.
Yeah. Or, he's low-key TikTok famous, but we don't have to get into that. Get out of here. Man, Devon, thank you so much for doing this episode of the podcast with me. It was super, super valuable for anybody and everybody watching. And thank you for what you do just in the space, just pouring into athletes of the next generation and people of the next generation more so than anything. So I appreciate you, man.
Hey, thank you, Brandon. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Anytime.